It's no secret that over the years DBD has had plenty of controversial perks, whether it's due to incredibly high pick rates, game-breaking exploits, or the perks being simply overpowered. And for the most part, the way the dev team has handled these perks can be described as bizarre to say the least. Whether it be ignoring them for literally years at a time or giving them the most minuscule, meaningless changes imaginable, or even bouncing back and forth between random buffs and nerfs every now and then, surely this balance by dice roll style only applies to the outliers, right? Well, what if I told you that this also extends to some of the most mundane and seemingly simple perks ever? And how simple, you might ask? How about literally just field of view? Yes, I kid you not, even Shadowborn, a perk that literally just increases your field of view, has had a bumpy ride too. And I would even argue that once upon a time, the perk was straight up better than it is now. Well, fun-wise. The bumpy journey of Shadowborn starts all the way back in patch 1.0.0 on DBD's release day, all the way back on the 14th of June 2016 with the release version of Shadowborn, which was drastically different to the one you're used to today. And here's how it goes. You have a keen vision in the darkness of the night. Your vision is 20% clearer and your field of view is considerably wider than normal. Highly sensitive to light, you get blinded 50% faster and take 75% longer to recover from this condition. Okay, I know for you newer players that never got to experience this version of Shadowborn, your mind must be racing right now. 20% clearer vision? What? Getting blinded 50% faster? That's nuts. Nearly as nuts as 100,000 of you being subscribed to the channel. Thank you so much, you guys are absolute legends. So let's set the scene as to why old Shadowborn was like that and why it actually made perfect sense. The first thing that's worth noting was that as this was a day one release perk, it was designed to fit in with how the devs thought the game would play, which was a much more stealth oriented, hide and seek type of playstyle. Maps were darker, fog was thicker, those completely broken Moonlight offerings were still in the game. Seriously, if you don't know about the Moonlight offerings, check out my Bully Squads video linked in the description because it was nuts. And pallet looping wasn't even widespread back then. What this meant was survivors were expected to spend much more time hiding, doing everything in their power to prevent a chase from even starting, which meant crouching in bushes, dark corners, hiding in lockers, and any other little corner they could slot themselves into. Since the game was darker and foggier, it genuinely did require some proper scouting and hunting to spot people. So Shadowborn's role was effectively making you eagle-eyed, so you can observe much more at once and spot those people lurking in the shadows. And the faster blinding speed? That was once again playing into the fantasy of being more attuned to seeing in the dark, therefore being much more sensitive to light. While I argue that perks should be, well, perks, this downside did make a lot of sense given the game's landscape at the time. This of course played further into the fantasy of the Wraith being the hunter of DBD's roster, with his perks being geared towards finding and tracking survivors, and the general role of the three killers were pretty clear. Wraith was the hunter, Billy was the chaser, and the trapper was the one that looked fancy in all the promotional material. This is likely the reason why you can't change your field of view in the options menu like every other game, as they actively chose to limit what the killers could see. Even to this day, the field of view gain from Shadowborn is loved by many, but I cannot express just how amazing that clearer vision felt. This was way before Nvidia Freestyle was released, so outside of decimating your monitor's display settings, this was pretty much your only option. And again, with naturally darker maps, Moonlight offerings, and survivors actually hiding, it absolutely served a purpose. And in fact, Shadowborn must have been serving that purpose a bit too well, because in a sentence I'm sure you never thought you'd hear, Shadowborn would be getting a nerf. Just over a month since the game's release, in patch 1.0.5, on the 4th of August 2016, the first Shadowborn nerf would hit. Nerf dramatically reduced the field of view gain. For any long-time DBD players, I'm sure that sentence likely hit you with some slight nostalgia, because back in the day, we didn't get actual values like we do nowadays. Instead, we just got phrases like slightly, moderately, and tremendously to describe values, which, truth be told, wasn't particularly helpful, as half the time they'd be using the wrong words. For instance, in some killer add-ons there would be multiple add-ons that did the same thing, but one would be described as a slight effect and the other would be a moderate effect. Yet in actuality, the one labelled as slight would have the same value as the one labelled as moderate, or sometimes even better than the one labelled as moderate. Anyway, after this nerf, Shadowborn's pick rate dropped lower and lower, and while its pick rate was nowhere near that of Self-Care or Brutal Strength, its pick rate did still go down, but it wasn't entirely directly because of the nerf. Introducing pallet looping. Of course, as we all know, players realised that due to survivors having a much smaller collision radius than killers, by running in loops around objects and structures, survivors could dramatically offset killers' faster movement speed, as they would effectively have to cover more distance compared to just running in a straight line. And while the community as a whole was much worse at pallet looping back then than they are nowadays, nonetheless, it did become widely known pretty quickly, and as a result, survivors felt more comfortable staying in the open and hiding less, making Shadowborn's scouting benefits less relevant. That being said, pallet looping was far from the main reason for Shadowborn's decline, even earning a reputation of being actively bad, the same way no Mither would be nowadays, and the main reason would be none other than Instablinds. I've already done a whole video on Instablinds, which is a hilarious watch, link in the description below, but basically survivors were able to speed up flashlight blinding to become almost instant, around half a second. These absolute lightsabers quickly became the bane of killer players' existence, as Lightborn didn't make killers immune to blinding like it does nowadays. With a fast sensitivity and fast reaction speeds, good killers could avoid the Instablinds mid-chase, but taking that half a second blinding speed, then speeding it up even further with Shadowborn's 50% faster blinding speed, you'd have to be out of your mind. So, despite how incredible it felt, objectively speaking, it was a terrible perk compared to the other meta picks at the time, like Brutal Strength and Enduring, which were both absolutely core on killers for multiple reasons that might be worth a video on its own. It wouldn't be until the 27th of April 2017 in patch 1.5.0 where Shadowborn would receive a buff. Increase the field of view gain. While the perk would claw back some of that juicy field of view that it had before, it would continue to see an even lower pick rate. Why is that, you may ask? Well, that's because 2 months prior, on the 11th of May 2017, the devs added none other than the Doctor, with his own field of view perk, Monitor and Abuse, which was simply more useful and also safer since it didn't have the blinding debuffs that Shadowborn had, at the expense of also not having the clearer vision either. So anybody that really wanted a higher field of view would simply use Monitor and Abuse instead, alongside the added bonus of having a smaller terror radius whenever not in a chase. Monitor and Abuse also had even more factors working in its favour. For starters, reducing the killer's terror radius by 8 meters was incredibly useful for Michael Myers, who was also added to the game during this time. Since in Tier 2 of Evil Within, which is the tier he spends most of his time in, he only had a terror radius of 16 meters compared to every other killer at 32 meters at the time. So by using Monitor and Abuse, he could reduce it by a further 8 meters, completely halving it. This made him much more effective at being stealthy and was pretty much core on him for quite a while. The perk also somewhat synergized with its owner, the Doctor, and his old kit. He actually used to be a stance switcher with 2 modes he could switch between. And he also had a passive where any survivor within his terror radius would slowly but constantly gain madness. So if he was in a chase, Monitor and Abuse instead inverts and increases the killer's terror radius by 8 meters, so he could apply this constant madness to all survivors in a whopping 40 meters of him. The only iffy part is that the first time any survivor entered his terror radius, they'd instantly hit tier 1 and scream, revealing their position, and Doctor players would use that for a very fast early game chase, so the reduced terror radius whenever he wasn't in a chase did affect him somewhat negatively. Due to its extremely limited use, 8 months later, on the 14th of December 2017, in patch 1.8.3, Shadowborn would receive some changes. Buff: no longer causes killers to get blinded 50% faster. Buff: no longer causes killers to recover from blindness slower. Buff: further increased the field of view gain, surpassing that of Monitor and Abuse. But unfortunately, there was one more change. Nerf: no longer grants the killer clearer vision. While Shadowborn had finally lost that debuff that made it borderline unusable, it had also been reduced to literally just a field of view increase and nothing else, how it stands today. This change was likely made for the same reason they removed the Moonlight offerings, as the devs stated that they wanted more control over the lighting of the maps, so they were now free to tune DBD's lighting to the fullest, so we can get much more vivid, vibrant and accurate lighting, and totally not just slapping blue, green or yellow over the entire map and calling it a day. While Shadowborn is objectively much better than it used to be, I personally believe that the perk just being a field of view increase leaves it as nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, where stealth was used regularly, hunting was a big part of the game, and there was a heavier focus on the fantasy of killer designs and minimal concern for balance. I'd argue that it's time for field of view to finally be made into a slider. For example, we finally got framerate, VSync and anti-aliasing options added into the game after all these years with the Alien chapter. So Shadowborn could get a new, tracking focused effect like the rest of the Wraith's perks. I'd love for it to just get that clearer vision effect back, but I think that ship has sailed.